Hello and welcome to Wander in Words. Today I will be making a part 2 to my most viewed video, which is everything I read as an English major. Or should I say everything I read as an English major, because I completed my degree. So I do have a bachelor's degree in English, which is essentially literature, and I decided to go back to university for a 5th year to complete the honors program. So it's a little bit different in every country, but in Canada, where I'm from, an honors degree just means that you've taken higher classes, so in my case 400 level classes, and I had to participate in this colloquium where I read a paper out loud in front of different professors. The reason some students decide to do the honors program is that it allows you to kind of improve your application if you decide to go to grad school in the future, which is what I would love to do one day. Alright, let's get started. All of the books that I am showing you are from classes I took from September of 2022 to April of 2023. This first set of books is from my decolonial literature class, so I will say that they are all very heavy in subject matter. The first book that I have here is A Small Place, and even though it is short and there are not a lot of pages, it is very impactful, and I would recommend it to those of you who are particularly fond of traveling like I am. And the reason for that is because it deals with tourism and the negative effects that foreigners have when they travel abroad. So if you've seen some of my other videos, you will know that I love traveling. At first I was like, well, I'm not like the tourist that they describe in this book, but then as I started to read it and we dissected it more in class, I realized that perhaps I have maybe contributed negatively to the tourism, and maybe I have like done some harm when I've traveled abroad, and the thought of that is really like disheartening. It's not like an easy thing to accept. So it does deal with the author's experience growing up on the country of Antigua. Why did I say on the country? Sorry, in the country. Am I an English major or what? So yeah, it shows her experience growing up in Antigua, and it also jumps between talking about her own perspective but also directly addressing the reader. So as you read it, it is the second person POV, which is different from a lot of other texts, of course, but it also means that you are a part of the problem in a way. You are the traveler. You are forced to kind of reckon with what the author is talking about. So it was really eye-opening for me, and it makes me want to be a more conscious traveler. The next book is Kiss of the Fur Queen by Thomas Highway, and it deals with Canadian residential schools. So Canada does have a very dark history, particularly involving the Indigenous peoples. So if you have never heard of it before, I would really recommend researching the history, because that is what you will read. I will say this book made me cry, okay? I had a very difficult time getting through this because it is very direct and kind of like explicit in a way. Like, you really feel like you are there with the characters as they experience many horrible situations. So if you want to read about the impact of residential schools and how all of these kind of racist tendencies impacted people and how they still impact people today, then this is a good piece of Canadian literature to pick up. The next text is Terra Nullius, and I will say this is about something similar to the book that I just mentioned. It deals a lot with racism, and instead of being set in Canada, it is set in Australia, and I hadn't really realized that Australian history was so similar to Canadian history in a lot of ways. So I learned a lot about history, but then also this book is a surprise. It is not just a historical fiction, it is also sci-fi. Yeah, I never would have guessed that those two genres could really collide. So at first, I would say maybe the first chunk of the book, you don't really know exactly what's going on. The people are just referred to as the natives. That's the word that they use in this text. I'm just copying it verbatim here. The colonizers, they come to Australia and they're really doing horrible things to children, similar to residential schools in Canada. But the second half of the book is not what you expect. I don't want to spoil it. Don't look up the second half of the book, because I think it's best experienced when you're really genuinely reading it, because when I got to this point of the book, I was like, what? Had I just missed something all along? I thought that maybe I just didn't understand what was happening, but then I continued reading it, we talked about it in class, and I realized that yeah, the point of the book is kind of to surprise you in a lot of ways. So read it if that sounds interesting, because I really like this book. It was a bit polarizing though. Some people did not like the sci-fi element, so give it a read, or if you have read it, let me know what you think. So are you team sci-fi or not sci-fi with that text? Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. So this is probably one of the most popular and common books on an English literature syllabus. Don't be surprised if you end up reading it. And if you are not in any literature classes and you're just curious about this kind of area, then I would recommend this one probably above all because it is so important. It is referenced all the time in like other like articles, and scholars, they always like talk about this text. So essentially it follows Okonkwo, and he actually gets banished from his tribe. So he is from the Igbo village. Am I saying that right? Oh my gosh.
Alright, I have a little editor side note here. So it seems that Igbo was how many texts were written before the 70s, and then after that it was changed back to Igbo, which is how it had been before colonization occurred, according to this video here. So if I'm saying it correctly, I think it's supposed to say Igbo.
But yes, he is from this village in Nigeria. He gets banished from his tribe and he has to go to another one, and it's interesting because you learn a lot about the Igbo people. The author is actually originally from that group, so it was very educational. But also the last little chunk of the book, whoa, I don't want to spoil it yet again because you need to read it, you know, you need to experience it for yourself. But one thing that this book really sparked kind of like in the conversation was the cover itself. Okay, so this cover here is interesting. The image is very symbolic. Also, some other publications show a rope with like a knot on it, and it kind of like foreshadows the ending. So it's interesting, like that conversation led us into like how publication can impact the reading experience, how the title and what it's like saying here can impact your experience going into the text. So Things Fall Apart, it's actually referencing a poem. I don't remember who wrote the poem, but I will put it here. But yeah, it's referencing a poem, so the title has a lot of like importance. It's really a must read for any literature student. Salt Baby by Fallon Johnson is a short play about a white passing First Nations woman who leaves her reserve and ends up dating a white man who her family disapproves of. So it's a lot of juggling like that relationship, how she feels with her indigeneity, and also her connection to her grandfather. It is written in like a simple manner, but it's so well done. It also talks about blood quantum and how the government has negatively like impacted people's identity of themselves. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad is an extremely controversial short story. It is not an easy read by any means. It is very troubling. The depictions of the people in this text will probably make your stomach turn negatively. So this is not something I would consider to be light reading despite the length of it. However, it is extremely important in literature and decolonial studies, and I would say that there's probably like a 99.9% chance that one of your professors or one of the texts that you read will reference this. In fact, Chinua Achebe, who as I mentioned wrote this text here, wrote a whole article. I think he had actually presented it in front of like university students, and he wrote it about this text. So needless to say, Chinua Achebe is not a fan of Joseph Conrad, and he despises this text.
Editor's note here, I want to say that this is a very controversial text. Some people think it's anti-colonialism and a critique of colonialism, while others firmly believe that it is definitely not that and that it's very problematic. So just approach this text with caution. It might bring up a lot of different feelings in class if you read it as a literature student.
So the reason it is troubling for a lot of people is because it presents the people in Congo as like this other, kind of like these people who are not really people, and it's really, really troubling. You will probably read it, so you might want to get a head start on it or something. Okay, now we're going to do a 180 and talk about Simone Weil. If you've never heard of her, she is a philosopher and writer, and I would say that she is also controversial. A lot of people think that she's like this genius, this like mastermind, and a lot of people think that she is problematic in the way that she contradicts herself all the time in her text. And maybe you will fall into the third category if you really like her work, but you also acknowledge that she's like very like conflicting with her ideas. So that's kind of like the perspective that my professor was coming from. She was like, yes, Simone Weil is definitely a woman who was imperfect, but she also has a lot of like great ideas that are relevant today. So she was born in 1909, as the back of this text says. Here's a picture of her, here she is again. And we spent this whole seminar, so from, what was it, December to the beginning of April talking about this woman. So there are so many bits of information that I would love to share about her life, but honestly that would just be like an hour-long video, and I think that it's best if you read about her if you want, because Simone Weil's work cannot really be fully understood, in my opinion, without understanding her life. Because you will read some of her ideas and you will say, what? But then if you know where she's coming from and the experiences she had, it kind of meshes well in that sense, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe I understand why she's talking about that. Like, for example, she talks a lot about pain or affliction, and if you learn about her life, you will know that she had like chronic headaches, a lot of like chronic pain, so she was very fascinated by the idea of pain and the meaning of pain. So you will see a lot of that in here. Also friendship. She didn't really have that many friends, but she kind of like yearned for friendship, so she's very lonely, and you can sense that a lot. I think that if you're going to start off with Simone Weil, I would probably recommend the thing about education. Let me just say the name of it here. Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. I would say that this is probably one of her easier pieces because it is more polished, and essentially in that part she talks about how every student should love learning. You don't have to necessarily love every subject, but you have to love learning in and of itself. So of course this is easy coming from someone like Weil, who was reportedly known as like a very intelligent student. She aced a lot of her classes, and I think her brother was also really good, if I'm not mistaken. So like she definitely did not struggle in a lot of these subjects. So some people are like, well, yeah, it's easy to like school and learning if you're good at it, but yeah, what she's saying is just like really valuing education essentially. There are so many ideas and I really can't do her work justice because I honestly did not understand a lot of them. Some of them are just beyond me. Up next is Gravity and Grace, also by Simone Weil. If you are interested in reading about her ideas and her work, I would recommend starting with Waiting for God, because Gravity and Grace is a bit more challenging in the sense that it is more unfinished. So after she passed away, her friend published a lot of her ideas. So every paragraph is from a different source, which means that it can sound a little rambly, repetitive, and confusing, but it's still worth a read because it is something that really got me thinking. Like this text, I had like scribbles all over the pages and I was like, is this what it means? And I was trying to like interpret everything. And I know like when it comes to writing and like philosophy, sometimes we are meant to interpret it differently, but at the same time, some of the guesses that I had like about what the text meant and stuff were different than what the professor had explained them to be. So while I think like I took a lot of like important ideas away from it, I maybe like understood it differently. So if you really want to like work your brain and read a lot about how you can kind of be like a better human in a way, then Simone Weil is a good philosopher to check out. I particularly like the ideas that she has about friendship and how we want to help people as much as we can. So in order to do that, we really have to put their needs, and if we see that someone is suffering, our goal, if we want to be a good human, is to help them. In addition to the other two texts, we also read The Liar's Wife by Mary Gordon. So this book here is full of different stories, but the one we specifically read was Simone Weil in New York. So as you would imagine, it is about Weil and her ideas. However, it's interesting because it's not like historical nonfiction, but rather it is fiction. So you will see Weil as a character in this story, and Genevieve, who is the protagonist, is not based on anyone in real life, but she encounters this character who is Weil, and in the story, Weil was actually her former teacher, because in real life Weil was a teacher. So Genevieve feels really conflicted because she knows that her former teacher is a very intelligent woman and has a lot of like really helpful and wonderful ideas, but at the same time she has flaws, and some of those flaws embarrass her. Like when Weil asks to go with her to the movies, it's like, okay, like read the room, Weil, you weren't really welcome to go along with them, but she just like invites herself to this outing, and it makes Genevieve uncomfortable. So in other words, Weil does not have very good social skills, and you kind of see a lot of those ideas. They're all based on factual information, so it is a really helpful read. It kind of like ties together a lot of the biographical information about Weil and her philosophical ideas. So I did really like this story. In fact, I wrote one of my big research papers on it. The next text is Holy the Firm by Annie Dillard, and oh my goodness, this is a very challenging read. I tried so hard to understand this. I don't think I was that successful. It was a real challenge, and I think that this is probably one of the most challenging texts we read in the class because all of my peers and I had an interesting time dissecting it. We really tried to figure out like what is the idea here. But essentially, this woman goes kind of into like this place of solitude, and she writes and has epiphanies, and one of like the symbols that she writes a lot about is like this moth and flame, and it's very like representative of bigger ideas. So maybe read it if you like philosophy. I can't recommend it because personally it wasn't my cup of tea, if you will. I think that because her ideas are in relation to Vase, we read this text, but if you are just interested in this whole like idea, I would just stick to Vase work. I find it more actually comprehensible. Let's switch things up and talk about my modernist class. So I had never studied modernism, let alone modernist literature, so this really was all brand new for me. So if I don't do the best at explaining it, I apologize, but I will try to wrap up what we learned in such an extensive and interesting class. So one of the first texts that we read happened to be Jacob's Room by Virginia Woolf. Now Woolf is iconic. I think we've all heard her name being thrown around in literature related circles or even other topics. For example, she wrote a piece called A Room of One's Own, and it talks a lot about how we have this potential, but a lot of the times we aren't really given like the space or the solitude to really like cultivate that potential, essentially. So she kind of argues in this piece that if we all had a room of our own and a modest amount of money and a door with a lock, then we all could really be creative. So I read that in one of my other classes, which I will get to, but for the modernist literature class in particular, this text here was one of the first ones we read, and it is interesting. I actually like annotated it. Look at these cute little corgi things. I love them. I just thought they were so cute. My sister bought them for me, so I absolutely loved annotating with them. And if you want to see how I annotate, I will put the video, I feel like a real YouTuber, like pointing to the sides of the screen. I don't know which way though, but I will insert it in case you want to check out how I annotate. Every book is of course a little bit different, but I try to break down the different ways that I go about annotating in that video. Back to the text. It's interesting because Jacob, who is kind of like our main character but not really at the same time, is a young man. He grew up in a pretty, I would say, maybe low class family, perhaps, maybe like middle class? No, I would say like low class. Anyway, he didn't grow up rich by any means, but he gets accepted into Cambridge, and he is very intelligent, so he actually mingles well, he befriends a lot of people in high circles, and he really like can take on this persona of someone who grew up wealthy and in an affluent home. So it's interesting seeing kind of like that progression. He is really fond of literature, so you will see references in here if you're interested in that. But one of the things that we noted in class was how the narrator has a personality of her own. And I say her because it has been debated that the narrator of the story is actually a woman. There are a few kind of clues here and there, but one of the lines that I have like bookmarked with my finger is on page 22 of this version here, where the narrator says, "Nobody sees anyone as he is." And then the narrator goes on to like talk about like this character who is looking at Jacob, and Jacob doesn't really notice how this woman is like observing him. So it's really interesting. You'll see kind of like observational bits of like text kind of just like thrown in here, and it's like, well, whose story is it really? Well, I think that it's not really like about us falling in love with Jacob, because if you haven't read this text, you may be surprised to find that we as readers don't really know him on a personal level. Like, we know about his upbringing and we know that he's like friends with these people, as I mentioned, but we don't really know him too much beyond that. And that's actually the point of the text. So it is like making a comment on how society kind of like distances us from people. These young boys are raised, but they are lost too soon, so they're part of like this lost generation because Jacob in the end passes away in war. So it's kind of like how this system doesn't really allow people to flourish, it just erases them essentially. So that's why we never really get close to Jacob, because he never has time to grow up. He passes away at a young age, so the story feels incomplete, just the way Jacob's life is. So you kind of see that in here, and if you know that, it makes the book make a lot more sense, because while I was reading it, I was like, it's kind of dull. Like, Jacob is sort of a dull character. But then we learned why. Oh, and here is a book that I bought. It was Jacob's Room, but just in another version. I bought it not realizing that I had purchased the wrong version, and I wasn't able to return it, so that sucked. One of the other texts we read was The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, and it is an interesting read in the sense that it does not shy away from violence, particularly anarchy. So this story follows Verloc, who is a normal man on the outside but a secret agent or spy by night, and he enlists the help of Stevie, his brother-in-law, with the bombing of Greenwich, which in London is this place that has a lot of importance because it represents science, it represents time, so to destroy it would be like a big act of violence, but also like a symbolic one. So instead of getting his own hands dirty, Stevie does the work for him and is able to destroy this place. Unfortunately, Stevie passes away in the process, so it is a very nihilistic text. None of the characters, with the exception of Stevie, are good. They're all morally gray. There's no happy ending. There's no resolution. As soon as you think maybe like one character is one way, like Winnie, she does something that's conflicting. It makes a big comment on society, violence, anarchy, things that I am personally like not the most knowledgeable about, so hopefully I explained it okay. But as I said, I really just didn't love this text. It was okay for me. Not my favorite, not the worst thing I've ever read. And I do want to say that because I think a lot of people expect English majors to love every single thing that they read, which is honestly not the case. Like, I read a lot of texts during my time as an English major that I just didn't enjoy whatsoever. So if you are an English major, or if you're planning on becoming one, just know that it's not all fun. Like, we're not just reading Jane Austen and Shakespeare all day. Some things are very difficult to get through. Some of the subject matters are just really difficult to process. Yeah, I just wanted to put like a little disclaimer that not everything here is going to be your cup of tea, and that's okay, but you still probably need to read it, unfortunately. While we read a lot of text in this Modernist class, I will also talk about The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot because this one is pretty iconic when it comes to Modernist literature. So it is actually pretty short. I have this printout version here with a lot of my notes on it. And the first task that my professor gave us was to read this and then read it again, this time looking out where you may hear the narrator change, so like a different voice popping up essentially, and we had to count how many voices or different narrators we thought there were. I said 18. It was just honestly a ballpark number because as I was reading it, I was trying to like figure out when the vibe kind of shifted and if maybe a voice had like appeared again from before. It was a little bit tricky, and I thought maybe there was like a clear answer, and our professor ended up telling us like there's really like no wrong answer, at least according to what she said. You can interpret it differently. Someone in my class thought there was just one voice. Someone had even said like 30 voices. So yeah, there was like a really big like range there. Like the first voice, for example, is complaining about spring. This voice is really like unhappy with spring. They don't like it, and it's like, well, why don't you like spring? It's like this fresh, happy time, but this voice is not having it. So you can kind of read like different snippets, and of course they all have like a bigger meaning, and they kind of like weave in with one another. The thing with Modernist literature is that it's very experimental, so reading it is sometimes an interesting process. It can be really short, but it may take you a long time to get through just because it is sometimes written in like a different way. It's not clear. It's like, ooh. Another text that I want to talk about is Ernest Hemingway's 1924 In Our Time, and that is all lowercase. So In Our Time is similar to The Wasteland in the sense that it is like a bunch of different stories with different characters in this one collection. And upon reading it, you may also ask yourself, what does this have to do with one another? But then you'll realize that there are different themes, like for example, bullfighting. There are a few stories on bullfighting. There are, I think, 2 stories about cops. So you kind of get like different themes popping out, and of course the idea that kind of weaves them together is violence, but also, interestingly enough, there's violence with the form of the text. So the chapters are lowercase, they don't really make any coherent sense. It's like, why is this story here? Why is that story there? There are just so many elements to this collection that will have you kind of like scratching your head. So I decided to write my paper about how how Ernest Hemingway kind of defies typical writing conventions and how by doing that he's able to heighten the sense of violence in this collection. Alright, now it's time to talk about my favorite class, Victorian literature. I took one of these classes before and I fell in love with this kind of literature, and I was so fortunate to be able to enroll in another class, although this one was focused solely on short fiction. And one thing that these short stories had in common was that they had characters with disability. And I really found this to be so fascinating because a lot of the stereotypes and problematic representations that we see in these stories from the Victorian time period still permeate in society today. So we definitely need to do better with our storytelling, and we need to be more conscious of these problems. And one thing that our professor did was really educate us about disability models, and I think that they're like helpful to study if you want to like understand how to critically engage with different texts while talking about disability studies. So I am no expert in this topic, like I don't claim to be an expert in anything really, but definitely not in disability studies, so hopefully I explain everything as best as I can. But I will say that I absolutely loved this class, and it really opened my eyes up to how stories are written today. So we read a lot of short fiction just because you can get through short stories a lot faster than you can with novels, of course. So I'll talk about a few of them because I know that this video is probably getting really long. I'm sorry, I am quite chatty. But one of the texts that we read was The Well of Penmorpha by Elizabeth Gaskell. Love her. So even though the story is far from perfect, I really like dissecting it and talking about it in class. In fact, I wrote one of my essays about it. So The Well of Penmorpha is about Nest, a young, beautiful girl, and she's very vain. So the people in her town view her as like this very conceited girl. One day she slips because she decided to wear this unnecessarily fancy, I think jacket or dress was it? This outfit essentially. And it was not practical by any means, and she ends up slipping and harming herself. And she ends up with this, I think, like inability to move. And as you read the story and as you talk about the different models, you start to see how her disability is presented in the story as a punishment for being vain, which of course is definitely not how we should view disability, but that's how Gaskell portrays it in this story. So it was really interesting dissecting that and talking about how this problem is viewed as punishment from God. So the moral model is definitely a big one here. Nest in the end actually does find closure with her situation, so even though she doesn't necessarily go back to the bodily functions that she had prior to her accident, she ends up finding peace and solace with her situation because she ends up being the caretaker for this other girl. I think her name is Mary, and yeah, it's interesting to see how they get along with each other, how they interact, although that relationship also brings up other issues, namely disability hierarchy. So you can really just like break down these stories in so many layers and talk about how they're problematic, but also how they can educate us. So honestly, we read so many different stories. I could talk about them all day. If you're interested, maybe I can talk about more of my favorite Victorian literature stories, but for now, I think I'll just stick to this one because I don't want this video to be like 5 hours long. Alright, we are getting to the end of the classes that I took for the honors program with my English degree. One of those classes was Literary Theory and Criticism, and our professor had to go and make us buy this $150 book. I think it was, yeah, somewhere in that price range. You know how annoying this was carrying this in my bag 3 times a week? It is a hefty book, okay? I just have to tell you how many pages it has so you have an idea. Because, yeah. It has over 2,700 pages, okay? And when I tell you that this was very uncomfortable to read, I am not joking. I found this class to be challenging, especially at the beginning, but I ended up loving it and I worked so hard on it. It was probably the class that I ever spent the most time on, okay? One time I broke down crying because I had no idea what to write about for one of the papers, and I ended up getting an 85 on that paper, and for me that was just like a grade that like blew me out of the water because I had expected to nearly fail. As we progressed throughout the course, a lot of the theories actually became easier to understand because they were more contemporary, more relevant to what I've studied in other classes. There are so many different theories that we talked about. I'm gonna just show you here on the screen because every theory is so diverse. But yes, we read many pages in this book. Definitely not 2,700, but quite a few, I would say, and I liked it after all. So it just goes to show that challenging classes, if you put the right work and time into them, they can be fulfilling. And in this class we also read Billy Budd Sailor and Other Stories by Henry Melville. My prof was just a really big fan of Melville, so I think this was just an excuse to talk about him and make us read this book, honestly. But it was interesting because this is a story, of course, a lot of stories, but you had to understand it as a secondary text rather than a primary one. And the primary texts in this course were ones from this beast. So it's kind of like the opposite of typical literature classes. Alright, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I really appreciate that you decided to watch it and have this little like chat about books with me. If you have any recommendations for other books that I should read, please feel free to leave them below. And if you read any of these for your English degree like I did, also feel free to share that. It's nice to see what English majors from around the world have on their syllabi, so thank you.